Hello, we're going to give people a few seconds to join in. Hi, everyone. Alrighty, so as more people join us, if you have any questions throughout this webinar, add them please to the chat, making sure you're sending the question to everyone and not just host and panelists. And as we wait for more people to join in, add in where you're calling from today in the chat. I'm calling in from Montreal today. It's actually a nice day today, not too hot. It's been hot here. We have some note takers. Wisconsin, Dallas. Awesome. Minneapolis, New Orleans. Oh, well, amazing. Atlanta, Ohio, Toronto. Wow, got a good spread of all people all over North America. Denmark as well. Amazing. Yes, we will share the presentation afterwards. Don't worry about that. You'll get an email with the presentation and access to the recording as well. Alrighty, so without further ado, welcome to today's Tigerhall webinar. Our session features Nellie Wartoft. She is CEO of Tigerhall. And today's topic is AI for AI, building the transformation office that drives enterprise AI adoption. Nellie, take it away.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everyone, for being here with us for this hour. Special shout out to the person in Denmark. I am just on the other side of the ocean from you. I'm in Stockholm, Sweden today. And good to see so many of you from all over the world coming in to hear how are we building the transformation office that drives enterprise AI adoption. So where the world stands, as all of you are familiar with, always on transformation is the reality that we're all living in today. 10, 15 years ago, you could have had one transformation initiative, start it, bring in the consultants, deliver it, wind it down, call it a day, and then get back to business as usual. But this is no longer the case, right? Today, there is no more business as usual, but rather CAU instead of BAU, being change as usual. And that is what we're all living through with this constantly overlapping pipeline of change initiatives that are coming in on a pretty much daily basis now. And then looking at adding AI to that mix, which is something that I think pretty much all organizations are driving at this point. This is what brings us to another inflection point when it comes to the amount of change that we're experiencing. And Gartner does some great research on this and looking at the number of change impacts that every employee is experiencing every year. And if we look at that over the last 10, 15 years, it's gone from 0.7, like barely one a year, and then people could easily keep up with it, right? To now being close to 30. So that means that every second week, pretty much, or more than every second week, employees have a new thing hitting them. And the thing with adding AI to this mix, right, is that AI is not a technology change. And we know that there are still many organizations that roll it out like it's another ERP or another tool to adopt, but that's not the best way to do it. And it's not the way that the technology works, right? Because it might start as a technology change, but what the thing is with AI is that it then very quickly leads to process changes, operating model changes, business model changes, and culture change, and everything else is changing with it. So it truly transforms how we run organizations, how we lead teams, and how we operate as businesses. And in all of that, for us who are in transformation and change, that is driving a need for an entirely new operating model of how we're driving change and transformation in this era of AI. And there are a few reasons for this, right? And this is no stranger to any of you, but first of all, the credibility risk. If you're leading an AI transformation and doing that in the old school way, it's a little bit like introducing the internet with a fax machine. It's a little bit jarring. And I hear from many transformation leaders now that they want to lead and be at the forefront of AI and having AI as the way that they run an AI transformation, which when you think of it makes a ton of sense, right? And part of that is, of course, for credibility reasons as well. It's hard to go out to the organization and tell everyone to use AI and adopt AI when you're not adopting it yourself. So that's one of the reasons. Then, of course, efficiency. Across the board, across organizations, everyone is asking, can we do more for less? Can we reduce headcount? Can we do more with the teams that we already have? And the transformation office is no stranger to that. That's something that will affect them too. And then when it comes to speed, if you look at the speed of how the world is moving, and looking at internal speed relative to how quickly we're moving externally. If there's a disconnect, if the external world is moving faster and faster, but the internal world isn't, really hard to drive change. And you're always going to be steps and miles behind if your internal speed isn't keeping up with the external environment. And as we know, the external environment is moving faster and faster and faster. So part of this is also to just keep up with how the rest of the world is moving. And then, of course, a big piece of scalability, because the thing about AI and what it allows you to do is to actually do much more with less, and being able to scale change and transformation in a way that we haven't really been able to do before in the manual traditional way. And that gives you a lot more ROI on what you're working on as well. So these are the four core reasons for why the need for this new transformation operating model is coming up more and more frequently. And there are already organizations that are transitioning into an AI operating model when they run transformation. And I'll share some of those throughout the presentation today as case studies for you to learn from as well. So what we'll look at is how are we then building the AI operating model when change needs a change? And this is primarily about driving three outcomes. It's about effectiveness, and you could argue efficiency too. Effectiveness, driving adoption, achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve. It is about speed. There is no executive in the world that wants to go slower. Everyone just wants to move faster and faster all the time. And it is about scalability. And I think the scalability aspect is a fairly unique or important one for transformation leaders, especially because if you compare transformation offices to revenue teams or operations or finance, there's a stark difference in headcount, right? Most of the teams that we work with at Tigerhall as our customers, most of them are 2, 3, 4, 5 people, maybe sometimes 10, driving change for 20, 30, 40, 100,000 of employees. So when you think of that ratio, it's usually a 1 to 10,000 person ratio. And that drives an even greater need for scalability. And that's one of the beauties of AI, is that it can scale massively what you're doing, even when you have a small team. So when we look at Tigerhall, for example, having 1 or 2 people plus Tigerhall equals what 15 or 20 people would do in the old model. So you get massive wins there from an efficiency and scalability point of view. And what does this look like then? What are the key components of driving and building this AI operating model? So these are the 4 things that we're going to cover today and walk through in detail how you do these, what are the best practices, and how have other organizations achieved these and building this way of working. So we're going to start with looking at the models and the context layer, because that's the foundation for all AI. Is, of course, you need a large language model and AI behind it. Then we're going to look at the data flywheel, which is how you're feeding those models and building the context layer. Then we'll get to workflow mapping and looking at both transformation and change activation in those workflows. What can you change? How do you map it out? What's hybrid? What's human? What's AI? And so forth. And then we'll talk about decentralization and what's the manager's role in all of this change as well. So let's begin with models and looking at the context layer. And I'll start with asking the people in the room, how many of you have a foundation model that you have access to at work, and which model do you have access to? So feel free to put in the chat if you have access to a GPT or a Gemini or a Claude or any kind of model that you have access to. And feel free to name the specific model as well, if there is a specific one you're using. Copilot, Claude, multi-model. I'm using gateways, GPT and Claude. So all of them. This is always interesting to see how it changes over time as well. Copilot being a big winner for obvious reasons. And Claude coming up more and more too. A year or 18 months ago, Claude was nowhere near as big as it is today. They've really had their moment in the last 12 months. Personally, I'm a big Claude fan too. Okay, so seems like most are central around like these 3. So a lot of Copilot, a lot of them Claude, Gemini, and a mix. So Copilot or like Microsoft models, some of them use OpenAI Foundation models, some are Azure models, and that would go into this layer as well. Then next question for the chat. How many of you, in relation to the models that you work with, how many of you have built a context layer to the model that you're working with? Or using MCP servers? You can put MCP in the chat if you're using MCP, or context layer if you built a context layer. Many, yes. Paul has an MCP. Good. Some MCPs. CJ asks a good question. What is a context layer? And fragment, yeah, that's very common as well, Nathan, to have fragmented context layer, not org-wide. And to CJ's question, what is a context layer? So this is the first thing we'll get into when it comes to how do we build this operating model. So you have a foundation model, that's great. Now the next thing you want to do is exactly that, building a context layer. Now, why is this so important? The context layer is very important because if you don't have a context layer, your outputs and everything that you're doing with the models are basically as generic as everyone else doing with the models. So if you use an Anthropic model and you put in a prompt, and then someone in your competition is putting in the exact same prompt, your output is going to be exactly similar. You're going to be pretty much 99% getting the same output. And there was a case study of this where there was a company that was looking at a new marketing agency, a new creative agency, and they did an RFP, and they collected this RFP responses from 6 different creative agencies. Out of those 6, 4 submitted the exact same RFP response. It was identical. And that was because they had gone into a model, they had put in a prompt, but they had no context layer. So it was exactly the same thing. And of course, all AI generated that they submitted. So what makes the difference here is to have a context layer, which tells the model around who you are. Who are you? Which organization are you part of? How does that organization operate? How are you governing it? Everything around the context around what is the work that you're doing. So this is where you can feed like your strategy documents, your planning overview, all the different initiatives that you're working on. So basically everything around telling it what to do, as in like what is the context that it's operating in. Because without that context, it's just like a brain that doesn't really know what world it's living in. So the context layer that is then telling the model what world is it living in. And MCP is where you connect to the rest of the data lakes of your organization. So a few different data sources, and what you have here on the slide are examples. When you look at, for example, SQL databases, Microsoft Graph is great if you can get access to Microsoft Graph. That basically captures all the work that you have across your Microsoft ecosystem. So think all your SharePoints, all your chatting on Microsoft Teams, your meeting notes, your CEO's emails, if you have the highest level of Microsoft Graph access. So this captures things in your Microsoft environment. And then, of course, all sorts of systems of records. So think your ERP, CRM, HRIS, and so on. If you have all of these MCP servers connected, that means that in addition to the context layer, the model also knows what is the data that it can pull from all of your different data sources. And MCP servers are very easy and straightforward to set up. So go talk to your IT team, tell them you're looking for an MCP server to that specific tool that you have internally, and pull that into your working environment where you have the model. And then when you think of the context layer, the way to start building that is think of it as a knowledge base. So you might have, for example, change management playbooks, you might have methodologies for how you run transformation. What are your KPIs? What's the wider strategy? What are your objectives? Different personas you're working with? All of those things go into the knowledge base. So a very easy and simplified way of thinking about the context layer knowledge base is think of it as a SharePoint site where you have all the documentation and access to everything that the model needs to know about your transformation office and how you're running transformation. So that goes into your context layer. And then with that context layer, together with the model, you can then do a whole load of different things, right? That brings that scalability and speed into the transformation work that you're doing. So some examples here, everything from adoption insights to how do you drive personalized nudges in the flow of work, enabling managers, building those executive narratives, storytelling for board meetings, ton of different things that you can do when it has access to the right data. So think of all the data around like driving adoption, for example, right? If it has access to your Copilot, your Microsoft Suite, your ERP data, very easy to build like adoption dashboards and so forth. And all sorts of like executive reporting, steerco, board meeting decks, and so on. Then what many miss, so they might have the knowledge base and they have the MCP connection. The last piece that you want to think about in this entire setup and model is then to have the feedback loop. And this is where many do a really good job of setting this up at the start, and they build the knowledge base, they have all the documents, and they start working with it. But then what you want to do is you want to capture the outcomes that come out of what you're doing, because this is the way that you keep feeding the knowledge base. So the initial knowledge base that you have, that might be existing PDFs, PowerPoint documents, meeting recordings, Word documents, like anything that you have today. And in my experience, there's no shortage of PowerPoint decks in organizations. So you probably have quite enough for a knowledge base to get going with. But then what makes the knowledge base smarter and smarter over time is when you actually feed the outcomes back into the knowledge base. So you want to use that to, in a way, fine-tune, like you're not fine-tuning models, but you're fine-tuning the outputs of the model as you're working with it in your transformation work, because you keep feeding it the outcomes. So that means, for example, if you're doing like the adoption insights, keep feeding the adoption insights by persona back into the knowledge base so that it knows, okay, this is how we're trending on adoption. And then that goes into your executive narrative for a board meeting, for example. Or the personalized nudges, like what actually drives that adoption, what works, what doesn't, how do different managers respond to these things. All of that is output that you feed back into the knowledge base. So think of this as the data flywheel, and this is what we'll talk about next, is how you make sure that all the data then continuously goes back into the knowledge base. So what I recommend, it seems like most of you have a model, so that's a great place to start. Hard to do any of this without a model. What you want to start with is start with that context layer. If you use Claude, it's a markdown file. So you can create a markdown file and it can be 1,000 pages long. I think my markdown file at this point is like 2,500 pages. And that's the context layer for everything. And the beauty of these context layers, right, is that you don't have to write them. You don't have to build them. The AI does that for you. So you feed it the context and then you ask it to build a context layer, because the models are good enough to understand that is what it's supposed to do, and then build that context layer for you. So that's where you can get started. And then the MCP servers. So what is the transformation that you're running? If it's an ERP implementation, incredibly important to have an MCP connection with the ERP. If you're driving Copilot adoption, then have that MCP with Copilot, for example. So make sure that you have the right systems and the right data connected based on the initiatives that you're running, and then starting that feedback loop with the outputs. So then taking that next one into the data flywheel. That is the start where you collect those outputs, feed it back into the knowledge base so that it goes into the data layer. And this is the difference between those who get further in this AI operating model and the ones that just get started and do kind of like the same output over and over again. And there's a difference here between what you call open loop system and then closed loop system. So what many are doing, and this is coming from the old mindset of thinking of how we run projects and how we report and so on, many are thinking in an open loop system way. And what that means is that you do something, you execute something, and then at the end of that, the output is data, and the data is meant to go into a PowerPoint deck that goes into a SharePoint site and never sees the light of day again. That's how most organizations today are treating data. So the biggest mindset shift in starting to think more along these lines of how do we drive an AI operating model in transformation is to start building closed loop systems. And this starts with a mindset, right? It starts with a mindset that data is not something that you report in a PowerPoint deck, but data is something that you use as an input. And think of everything that are those outcomes from everything that you produce, everything that you action, all of those outputs becoming inputs to then further feed that compounding competitive advantage. Because this is how your context layer gets smarter and smarter over time, gets faster and faster. So for those of you who might feel like you continuously have to prompt over and over again and keep going back and editing. Like for those of you who aren't happy with your AI outputs, in 80% of the cases, it refers back to the fact that you don't have a strong enough context layer and you don't have a closed loop system. And what that means is that the AI doesn't know you well enough. It doesn't know what you want. It doesn't know the context that it should operate in. So you haven't given it enough context and understanding. One of the mistakes in thinking about data, so we talk a lot about data when it comes to AI. Many think that data have to be quantitative and that it has to be structured. And those are two of the biggest myths. You do not have to have structured data. It needs to be accurate, but it doesn't need to be structured. So it can be very messy as long as it's accurate, and it does not have to be quantitative. Actually, AI works sometimes even better. I would say in many cases even better with qualitative data. So things like meeting recordings, great context. Things like PowerPoint decks, Word documents, even a voice note, like talking to your phone and it creates a voice note, great context. So don't think of it as like a CSV file full of numbers. Think of it as documents, text, knowledge, understanding, meeting recordings, voice notes, all of those are great data as well. So this is what then leads to what we call the flywheel effect. So once you have that context, the knowledge base, that is what is the beginning of then autonomous execution, to be able to drive autonomous execution in what you're doing in transformation. And then coming back to that flywheel of closed loop, you want that execution to then, with the data it generates, to continuously feed the context and the knowledge base so that it keeps going in a circle. And if we take an example of this, take something like personalization, which is what we know works absolute best when it comes to driving adoption. Generic mass emails, big town halls doesn't really work in making people adopt change, right? You need to be persona-based, it needs to be personalized, it needs to be targeted, it needs to be segmented. And this is where AI can do an absolutely fantastic job that it was not even able to do at all. Like we couldn't do this 10 years ago, right? Before AI. But now with AI, you can personalize to every single individual in the company. And when you think of this flywheel, think of it as the first time you personalize, you might do something high level, fairly broad, persona based, send that out. But then the key here is to observe and see what happens and see how are people reacting to this? Who's opening it? Who's finishing it? Who's applying the knowledge? Who's then adopting the change? Like who are we seeing? Are we seeing sentiment shifts? All of those data points then go back into the model so that you can then classify, reason, see what's happening, and then updating the knowledge base with that. So that the next time you personalize, it's even more targeted and even better. Because now the model knows, oh, this is a person who consumed the content, for example, but they didn't adopt the system. Okay, this is what might be something we want to change. This is someone that loved having a short podcast to listen to in their local language. Okay, now we learn that, so that's where we feed them the next time. So it becomes the system that always learns and keeps learning about different audiences, different individuals over time. And all of this comes back to that feedback loop, right? And understanding who needs what at what time. And one of the things here is like, as much as the world is changing and our organizations are changing, the somewhat beauty in all of this is that humans tend to actually not change as much. So if you can learn humans' preferences when it comes to how do they want to be communicated with, what kind of questions do they usually have, what kind of concerns do they have, what time is the best way to address them? Do they want to be spoken with on Monday morning, or do they want to tell you, I don't want to talk to anyone on Monday morning? All of these small things, all of their habits and preferences and how they want to be addressed, that tends to not change over time and definitely not change initiative to initiative. So if you can learn what are different audiences' preferences, how do you best engage them, how do you best activate them, how do you best drive adoption with different groups, that is something that leads to this flywheel over time. So when you think of these different personas, people can then move between these different personas, and the model then learns what do different people need at different times, and then serve them exactly what they need based on those data points. Then a case study of a company that did this really well, this was around a Copilot rollout, and they really struggled with getting Copilot adoption because everyone was like, kind of like, why do I need this? I have so much other work to do, and like this is not really applying to us because we're a consumer goods company, we're not a tech company. And they had a lot of that kind of fatigue, or just like irrelevance coming from the audience. So what they started doing is they started identifying, okay, what are the core workflows and the use cases where we want people to use Copilot in this case, and what is our overall AI strategy. And then they started with activation very much based on people's roles and what are their different use cases, and also what's used by their different peers. Because one of the key things in driving AI adoption, and we see this over and over again, is how much more relevant it is when you hear from like, oh, your colleague is doing this. Like you're Bob in finance, and we see Mark in finance actually using Copilot for this purpose. Feeding Bob that information that Mark is using it is so much more powerful than feeding Bob, hey, we're an AI company now and you have access to Copilot and go do this and that. So being able to feed people what's used by their peers, that's incredibly powerful. And to be able to do that, they then had that feedback loop where they could look at prompt usage. So this was an MCP with Copilot in their case, and very easy given everything is within the Microsoft ecosystem. Seeing what people used it for, and then classing that by different personas, seeing what was the prompt output. So what did they actually do? What were the different use cases? What did they use Copilot for? And feeding that back into the context. So the context kept learning. This is how Bob is using Copilot. This is how Mark is using Copilot. This is how finance is using Copilot. And then be able to see through the MCP that this is Sally over here and she's not using it at all, but Bob and Mark are using it in this way. And then feed personalized, highly, highly relevant content to Sally based on what her colleagues were doing. So with that approach, they saw 91% adoption within 90 days. It suddenly changed everything because you had a few psychological factors kicking in at once, right? You had both the relevance and the personalization. It wasn't this broad, hey, we have Copilot, hey, we're doing AI, this and that. It wasn't this hyperbole kind of communication campaign. It was super targeted to what their workflows were and what they're doing day to day. Two, it was FOMO. It was, oh, shit, like Mark is using this, but like I'm better than Mark. So I need to make sure that like I'm using this as well if Mark is doing it. And three, it was very much focused on their specific roles and unique use cases. So they also saw, given they looked at the feedback, they saw a 12x increase in the number of use cases and application areas as well. Because given they looked at the feedback, it wasn't just a one-way blasting kind of adoption campaign. It was very much looking at the feedback of how people were using it, and people knew that. So it started surfacing much more. So it became this like self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, or a virtuous cycle where more use cases led to more usage, led to more use cases, led to more usage. So that's the flywheel that they put in motion. So once you have the model and the context layer, and you have this data flywheel going, meaning that you capture the data, you use it for things to push out, and you keep capturing that in the context. The next thing is then looking at the workflows and looking at what are you actually doing today? What is your team doing? What are those different tasks in different areas? And this will be very different organization to organization. So looking at this, you will need to then build your own life cycle and what are the workflows that you're doing in your team. But as an example, if we look at a legacy life cycle where you have these different elements and mapping out how much time are each of them taking, and then looking at all of those and taking an AI augmented lens to what can you do with AI alone? What can you use AI for across the board? What can you do hybrid? So having AI help human and having that combination, and how can you then move things? And one caveat with this is that many times when you do this, it's many of these things that will then lead to you not having to do any of those workflows at all, because you would then like merge them and have like, you might, if you do A, B, C, D, E today, maybe C and D is not even necessary in an AI model. So this is a bit of a simplified view. And you'll get these slides afterwards. So you'll see all of the small fine print on the slide as well, which details in more detail what exactly AI can do, what humans are still involved with, and so on. But mapping it out, and what I recommend is starting with the big broad buckets. So think of like in broad terms, what are you doing across strategy, across planning, across execution, and think of those outputs in broad terms before you go down into detail. And the reason for that is precisely that if you have many of these small things that you might not even need to do anymore, you're not going to be able to catch that if you break it down in too much detail to begin with, but you're going to catch it at the high strategy level. So if you think of rolling out a strategy or aligning stakeholders or something, there might be something that you can just do in much shorter time span. So start broader, big buckets, and then you go down smaller. And once you map this out, what you should be able to get to give you some benchmark numbers, what we're seeing across the board in terms of the shift when people are doing this, from a transformation, like broad lens overview, things that before would have taken 1.5 to 2 years, many times can be moved down to a quarter. So that's about the efficiency and change in time spent. In terms of FTE weeks, many times it's a 90% reduction with these changes. And in terms of the phases, if you think of, in this example, there are 8 phases, it's around half of them that becomes human involved and half of them that are completely AI focused. So these are rough benchmarks of what you can expect when you start doing this workflow mapping and applying AI in those broad buckets. But then there are some things that are still recommended to not have AI involved, right? Yet you don't want AI to take any accountability. That is not a good idea. You don't want them to do risk acceptance and take that on your behalf. You still need to be involved with stakeholder alignment. And I know that's what most of you probably would want AI to do, is just to align the entire C-suite and then like not have to care about that. That would be great. Unfortunately, AI has a hard time doing that still. Maybe at some point it will. All things storytelling, setting the guardrails, making those big decisions, that is where you still need to have humans involved. And then getting to change activation, very close to my heart. If we take a similar lens here on change activation in outlining the different phases that are involved in that, these are the areas where you can involve a lot more AI. So across change activation, if we look at the similar numbers and human areas for these areas, when you see many of these things that would otherwise take between 19 to 32 weeks, is when you look at the traditional model, this is now down to 3 to 5 days. And much of this has been shaving off things in planning, shaving off huge components in content production, because content production is AI's number one use case, right? And that is what previously has taken a ton of time in change activation. Preparing communication campaigns, rolling out communication, crafting training, enablement, reference guides, documents, all of those things. So that's one of the reasons behind this big shift in time to launch. And also all the persona change impact assessment, these things, also massive, massive time reduction, right? And just looking at building out the personas, who needs what, driving the comms and enablement for these different personas, big reduction in time to launch. So looking at the workload, even bigger difference here than in transformation broader, from 27 FTE weeks down to about 1 for many of these, and human involved phases being 3 out of 8 on average, if we compare to those 8 buckets that we had on the previous slide. So very big change, especially from a change activation perspective, where you can do a lot of this work with AI. But then even here, there are still areas where humans are very essential, right? So in change activation, especially, a lot of it is around like storytelling, the more like high stakes storytelling, the context around it, energizing champions, like spreading that like energy and inspiration, which is so important to actually activate change, which is highly underrated. But the energy in an organization is kind of everything when it comes to change. All the things around manager enablement, coaching managers to lead through change, because change for many is still a highly emotional experience to go through, especially depending on what type of change it is. So you still want humans involved there to be those coaches from an emotional perspective, from a storytelling perspective, relationships, and all those energy areas. And of course, accountability as well. You still don't want AI to take accountability for your final outcomes. Not a good idea yet. Yeah, very big differences in these. And taking a case study again of an organization that did this workflow mapping and started shaving off a lot of time in what they're doing. This was a research and services provider. So they were, of course, massively, massively affected by AI as a force in their industry. So they wanted to do this wholesale AI operating model transformation across the entire company. So this involved changing products, changing how they run, changing everything essentially included in running the whole company. They had 5 people to do this, and 5 people changing 19,000 people and launching new products and everything that they were doing from an operating perspective. That was really, really hard. So they started looking at themselves first and looking at their team and saying, if we're going to change this entire organization to work in AI, how do we start? How do we become a role model for the rest of the organization if we're going to be the ones driving this from the top? And they went through 3 phases, which worked out really well. And this is what I believe all of you can copy. Is they started with looking at what is most time consuming today. And for them, it came down to reporting. They spent almost 50% of their time on reporting. It was a ton of steerco meetings. It was a ton of executive reports. It was a ton of updating different PowerPoint decks and so on. So reporting was the number one. Creating materials. So what we mentioned around creating enablement materials, training materials, communications, everything around all things material. And then reinforcement took a lot of time for them because rolling out AI tends to be high energy in the beginning. You have that announcement energy, but then how you actually reinforce this over time and ensuring that people don't drop off. They spent a ton of time in that area and making sure that, hey, like, remember to use this, remember to do this differently. And that was all manual. They did all of that manual with a very small team of 5 people. So that is what was most time consuming. So they started with inserting AI in all of those. So AI started doing the reporting, created all the materials, driving reinforcement. So that's what they set up first to then be able to look at what is low impact, high impact, what are some new capabilities that we can drive. So that started freeing up a ton of time, right? It freed up immediately around 60-70% of their time by just doing those 3 items. So they spent most of that time first. Then they started looking at what's low impact, high impact. And for them, low impact was town halls and emails. They didn't really get any change in AI adoption coming out of town halls and emails. And then on the other hand, they had a lot of engagement around like sponsors, manager enablement, engaging the organization in the AI transformation. So they then started thinking, how can we completely eliminate the town halls and emails, which is what they eventually did. And they started spending more time on sponsor engagement, manager enablement. So they very effectively shifted all the manual work that they spent on the reporting, material creating, and reinforcement into very high value relational work to spend with these sponsors and the managers to drive that energy and excitement in the orgs. And then they started getting net new capabilities as well. So persona-based enablement was something they had never been able to do before, that no organization had been able to do before, actually before AI. So getting that persona-based enablement going, and then having reinforcement being much more adaptive, meaning that it's not reinforcing everything to everyone at the same time, but actually knowing who needs what at what time, how do we best support different people across the board. So during this transformation, they also had a ton of layoffs, and that affected 2 people in their team. So they actually went from 5 people to 3 over this period of time. They were very, very quick in launching new strategies. So in 4 days, they were like launching new initiatives to the org, and they still couldn't cover 100%, but they got up to what they estimated to be between 85 to 90% of covering the initiatives that were actually going on in the organization. So but starting with what's most time consuming, that allows you to then free up a lot of time to think about where should you build these net new capabilities. So I thought that was a very smart way to start when they were looking at this. I'm going to take a quick look at the chat and see if there are any questions. For the case studies, do you know if either any result in employee reduction, especially? Yeah, very good question, John. So with those case studies so far, with the consumer goods and this research company, the research company went through a lot of employee reduction, but that was also for other reasons. I would say like it wasn't just implementing AI. In this case, they moved from 5 to 3 in this team, and they also had reductions in other parts of the business. In the consumer goods business, there was no employee reduction. So with the Copilot focus on driving Copilot adoption, it was more about how do we drive more efficiency, and actually employee satisfaction was a very big part for them around how do we make life better for employees and make sure that they have more time to do things and be more efficient and so on. And across the board, when it comes to doing this, like what I see many are doing is that rather than employee reduction, a lot of it is FTE avoidance. So I'm on calls pretty much every single day at this point where people are like I don't have to hire 10 people that I otherwise would have to hire. So I think much of this is not about reducing the employees that you already have, but I see a lot of organizations not hiring because they are implementing AI instead. So that's how I look at it instead, especially in transformation offices, because many transformation offices, they don't really get 15 headcount, here you go. So for them, AI in many cases also becomes kind of non-optional because otherwise they just cannot keep up with the load and the number of initiatives. So FTE avoidance rather than employee reduction, I would say. It's a good question. And exactly, Paula, it's more strategy focused, and that's what we're seeing across the board. Instead of spending all of this time on manual work, I think, in 5-10 years, we're going to look back and just see like I spent so much time on building PowerPoint slides. Like, what was I doing with my life? That's how we're all going to feel in 2030. And the same when it comes to putting together reports and preparing for meetings. And it's so much waste if you think of it. And actually, there's a podcast that I recorded with someone that's coming out in a few weeks, and he put it really nicely. He said maybe AI isn't here to take our jobs, because the jobs that we're doing, they weren't very human to begin with. So maybe AI is just coming back to reinsert itself in the roles that were just technical. Maybe it's us that have become machines, and we are just doing a job that should actually be done by a machine. So yeah, much more focused, to your point, Paula, on strategy, focused on the human aspect, spending more time with people. And I noticed that in my own work as well. I can spend so much more time with people because I don't have to do all of the manual work behind the scenes. And that's incredibly powerful in transformation, because transformation and change is all about people. It's all about making people do something different. So the more time you can spend with those people and less time with your spreadsheets and PowerPoints and decks and stuff, the better, and the more effective the transformation will be. Great points. Okay, lastly then, because even if we are an AI-powered transformation office, we have this solid team of 2 to 10 people, or however many you might be in your teams. There's still only so much that we can do. So the final piece in this operating model is, how do we move to a more decentralized model, and what is the manager's role in driving change in this AI operating model? And I think that the biggest shift, like beyond all the workflow stuff and moving from manual to strategy and all of these things that we've been talking about, the biggest shift that we're going to see in the next 3 to 5 years, especially in change and transformation, is this move from expert to everyone that comes with decentralization. If we look at these 3 companies, can anyone put in the chat which are these 3 companies? See if we have any logo recognition here today. Lovable, Canva, Spotify, Stripe. Good, Declan. Lovable, Canva. Great guesses. Declan got the first one, and sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, Declan or Declan. Yeah, the S looks like an insurance. The first one is Stripe. So correct, the Stripe. And what did Stripe do? Stripe enabled, and it's hard to think that 20 years ago it was only banks that could process payments, because now anyone and everywhere can process payments. And that's because of what Stripe did. It moved from you have to be a bank to process it to now everyone can process it. So moving from expert to everyone. Second one, many of you guessed correctly, Canva. What did Canva do? You don't have to be an Adobe Photoshop superstar expert designer. You can be anyone and suddenly you can design. So again, that shift from expert to everyone. And we had a few people that got the last one too. It is Lovable. So Lovable, for anyone who's vibe coding, for like fellow vibe coders, make yourselves known in the chat. You might know competitors Lovable as well, like Cursor and Replit and all these vibe coding tools. So Lovable is a platform for anyone to build software. So suddenly you don't have to be a software engineer anymore. Now everyone can just build an app, build your own platform, build anything you want by just using natural language, of course, AI. So all of these three companies at different times, like Stripe 20 years ago, Canva 10 years ago, Lovable now, this shift has come to pretty much every single industry, is moving from you need to be an expert in something to now everyone can do it. And you have tons and tons of more examples like this. I mean, take Airbnb. You don't have to be a hotel anymore. You can just rent out your room. Take Uber. You don't have to be a taxi driver. You can just drive your own car. A lot of these shifts have happened in so many other spaces. And this is the one that I think will come to change as well. Because it's impossible to send everyone for pro-site training and make everyone a transformation expert. Because now when we live in this world of always on transformation, always on change, and it's just going to be more and more and more, it's impossible to have 3, 4, 5 people in a central office being the only ones knowing how to do this. If you have 50,000 people in your organization, it doesn't make any sense that 49,995 of those 50,000 don't know how to lead change. That has to change. It has to be so many more that can lead change and transformation. And when we think of the role that AI can play here, is if you think of all of this, things like methodologies and certifications and trainings and models that you're using, this is a context layer. You can just serve this as a context layer to the rest of the organization. People don't have to know ADKAR or be ProSci certified. You can give them that context, but then they can operate through a natural language interface to actually make change happen in their own local teams. And the only questions that they need to ask, and this, again, coming all the way back to context layer knowledge base, if every single manager in your organization would answer the questions, what is your team doing today that it shouldn't be doing tomorrow? What should your team be doing tomorrow that they aren't doing today? And what will inspire or motivate them to get there? If all your managers answer these questions, imagine how powerful your change activation could be. Imagine the adoption you could get. Imagine the personalization you could get. And for them to just answer these questions into a natural language interface, into an AI model, where you have fed it with a context layer of those certifications and frameworks and methodologies and everything that you want. This is how people should run change in my organization. The model already knows that context. So collecting this information from your managers will unlock so much change, so much activation that people can just run it on their own, because the brain of knowing how to run change lies with the model, lies with the AI. And that's where AI becomes the true core in your operating model as a transformation office. And the beauty of this is that we've always thought in change and transformation that we have to balance between standardize and personalize. It's always been this trade-off. Like either we standardize and we run change the exact same way in the whole organization, and it's all just like peanut butter spreading it for everyone, and everyone gets the same thing, or we personalize and we do it super custom and we can go deeper and so on. But now, thanks to AI, we can actually do both at the same time, because you can centralize that context and have that context layer as the central brain while still decentralizing execution, and have your managers and leaders and employees at large, not just leaders, but everyone be involved and have that personalization happen. You don't have to choose anymore. And this to me is by far the most exciting thing about change and AI in change, is the fact that you can have centralized context, governance, control, knowledge, but decentralize how change actually happens and how people execute it. And there's one company that did this really well, going back to a case study, when they had this issue of they were coming from a central office. This was a big aerospace manufacturer. And centrally, they wanted to roll out this predictive maintenance platform on the manufacturing floors, which was AI driven. So it was an AI technology they wanted to roll out. They saw very, very slow plant adoption because there was a big disconnect between the corporate headquarters and what the culture was in these plants. So what they did essentially was they pretty much made themselves invisible, and they pretty much pretended like the transformation office doesn't exist, like it's been disbanded, and instead put all the execution with the local plant managers. And one thing here is like that governance balance, right? And what this organization did, they leaned towards like 60% standardization, 40% localization. So they gave the executives, the plant leaders and managers, all of that context, leveraged AI to have them then work with that AI on how do they best implement this in their plant, and then capture that knowledge. So this was the beauty of it, because all of these managers used AI to then understand that better and how to roll it out in their plans. All of that went straight back up to the governance and the visibility and the execution of that central office. So they got that visibility right while keeping execution localized. And then they could spend their time on coaching. So they could then see what is happening, right? So coming back to this human element of spending less time on manual work and more time with humans, they could then spend their time on coaching based on that feedback and reality on what was actually happening on the ground. So massive reduction in resistance, because people thought like, oh, this is not some big corporate person coming and talking to us, but it was actually something we do here locally. And they got to much, much faster value realization. So something they thought was going to take 12 months, they actually got adoption in 2 months after implementing this more localized execution approach. So one of the first ones to do this with an AI model at the center too. So those are really the four different elements of getting this operating model together, is having that modeling context there to begin with, making sure that your data is a flywheel so that you can use that data over and over again, map out your workflows and see where AI can take a bigger part, where humans are still involved, and then starting to think about decentralization and how you can leverage AI to empower your managers and your champions and sponsors across the organization to actually do a much more bigger role of driving that change as well. And with all of those four, what this then ends up looking like as an operating model is this kind of shift. So on the left side here, you have the traditional model, meaning you have strategy, sometimes happening internally, but many times externally. You have a consulting firm coming in, working with the C-suite, setting the strategy. That strategy then goes to the transformation management office, and they might have an OCM, change management, project management sitting in that transformation management office. Then they go out to the leaders, and then it becomes this cascade. The leaders cascading to middle managers, cascading to ICs, and it becomes this whispering game, and it's slow and it's hard to get it out to people and make it resonate and make it relevant for everyone in the organization. And then you might have a little bit of data trickling back up in some way or fashion that might reach the leadership and then might see some kind of like C-suite executive report. So it's a very top-down model. It's very one way, and it's very static and sequential, right? And if you compare this to running transformation in an AI-enabled operating model, the way that this works is your TMO essentially becomes the context layer. So when you think of executing initiatives, it's not this like pushing initiatives down across the organization. It's making the initiative smaller so that each team runs their own change and embeds that, and then having that run locally. Some of them will, of course, be larger across the entire organization, but still having teams then embedding that where they are and how that makes sense for them. And what the TMO then starts focusing on is strategy coordination, because you still need someone to coordinate across the organization, making sure that everyone is aligned to what is the strategy, what is the direction we're going in, providing the right context. The role of a context provider is becoming increasingly more and more important, because if you don't have the right context, then the AI is lost. The AI is no better than the context that it has. So you want to make sure it has the right context, the right governance, the right strategy, and that it has access to all the right data and so forth. And then it comes down to these elements on enabling people. So coaching, having that human element, enabling these managers and leaders to execute the change, being more of that coaching, advisory kind of person rather than a central team that executes everything. And then, of course, training the models and verifying outputs. So I'm sure you've noticed this in your personal lives as well, that what used to take creation time has now just shifted to review time because the AI's output, you need to spend more time reviewing. And that goes the same way here, verifying, and then making sure that this feedback loop works so that you have the right feedback loop engineering in place and that you actually capture the outputs as well. Because otherwise you're back to this open loop system where you create something, the data is spat out, it lands in a PowerPoint deck somewhere, and then it's never used again. So engineering this feedback loop that everything that is created, all of that data is actually fed back into the context. Those are 5 areas that become increasingly key for the transformation management office. But then decentralized execution, people run those initiatives, run the execution and the embedding of them in their own organizations, in their own parts, and you have intelligence that flows throughout, always on, all the time. So that's what an AI-enabled transformation office looks like. And I want to end with showing something that is coming up on Tigerhall, because Tigerhall, the business that I founded and the CEO of, is really a reflection of all the best practices that we see happening in transformation offices around the world. So it's all around what do we see works across organizations, what do they do well, and what can we build to then enable more organizations to actually practice those best practices. So with what we've been observing with what these best companies do when it comes to AI transformation, this is what is coming out on Tigerhall in 2 weeks to enable more organizations to build exactly this AI operating model too.
More change to execute, more visibility to provide, more ROI to deliver. With fewer resources somehow? Sure, meet Initiatives on Tigerhall. Give every transformation its own little world and its own big brain. It remembers your strategy, methodology, KPIs, any context you feed it, and everything you need later, from communications to reinforcement, will be created from that memory autonomously. With consistency enforcing itself, we're ready for decentralization at scale. Set up distinct owners and personas within each initiative. They do their thing while you keep an eye on everything. See how people act. Track how adoption trends. Compare, combine, correlate to find the indicators that predict success. If you're sharing these or need them for later, automate your executive reporting. Build your steer code dashboards. Export and revisit anytime. Excited yet? Initiatives on Tigerhall. Coming soon.
So that's what is coming up to enable everyone to build context layers easily, build knowledge bases easily, insert those feedback loops, and have all of the data feed the model so that you can execute autonomously at scale with the very, very small teams that we all know that you are, so that you need that scalability and speed to help you. So that's what we're up to and what is coming out in just 2 weeks. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm not sure if we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I'm always happy to deep dive as well. So feel free to reach out if you want to discuss this in more detail, learn more about how you can set this up, how you can build it yourself, and anything that we've been discussing today. Let me take a quick look at the chat and see if there's anything here. Otherwise,
I have a question from earlier on if you want me to feed you it.
yeah, feed it.
Awesome. So this is from Courtney. For organizations who do not have a dedicated transformation office today but want to build one, where would you advise they begin to create this AI first operating model?
So it depends on who owns the transformation. So even if you don't have an office, and that's a good question actually, because we many times work with operations and business units and things as well. So when we say transformation office, like that's great if the organization has made that investment. But even if you don't have a fully set up transformation office, just people are responsible for leading change and transformation, that works as well. So everything that we've shared here today works equally well, even if you don't have a transformation office set up. So my recommendation would still be thinking about that context layer, thinking of the data flywheel, and setting up this AI infrastructure to be able to execute at scale. And that works with any kind of team outside of transformation offices as well. So, and I see Karina's question, is the intro video available on your website? Not yet, but we can send it to you as part of the email that we're sending after this. And then shortly it will be available on the website too. So you're the first ones to get a sneak peek. All right. Great questions, everyone. And thank you so much for spending time. And we will get back with you soon. Thank you for being here and see you later.